Welcome, Red Eyes members. Thank you for tuning in. We are talking with Kevin Annett, a fascinating interview about the genocide in Canada, about the Native American population that has been subjected to extermination, as it were, by the church, by the government, and by all of the involved, so to speak, in the structure behind the government. And I want to continue this segment and talk a little bit about the mentality, if you will, of some of the people behind this. The mentality of the people also that maybe you have encountered, Kevin. You had this very short and brief thing in your film about basically the soullessness of these people. Some of these are totally dead. You mentioned before about the reaction from this woman that was totally dead, and it's like it's nothing there. What do you think about the mentality of these people? Or, I mean, you come from a Christian background, so I mean, are we talking about soulless people here? What do you think?
Well, I think it's. I remember one of the lawyers at Nuremberg, Robert Jackson. He was one of the American prosecutors in Nuremberg, and he was given a talk once to a synagogue in New York, sometime after the Nuremberg trials, and he shocked people because he said the Nazis were no different than you and I. He said that if you, under the right circumstances, if you put us in those conditions, most people would do what the Nazis did. And I thought that was very astute because, the whole mentality is when you're in a big institution, you go along with it, you surrender your capacity for moral judgment over to another authority figure. That's kind of the nature of a hierarchical institution.
Yeah.
I think Hannah Arendt, when she was covering the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem, she developed this term, the banality of evil, where she said, the problem in the 20th century is not psychopaths who are killing people. The problem is the bureaucratic mentality whereby we, working in an institution or a corporation or whatever, you're so compartmentalized, you don't have you don't see the outcome of your actions. You can be part of like a company that produces napalm, and yet you're not actually seeing the people being killed from it.
Yeah.
And it was the same in the residential schools. I've talked to people who used to work there who they had the kind of the attitude of, well, there are terrible things happening to the native kids, but I can at least help them a little bit in my own way. And if you tried to help them too much, of course, you were fired. I talked to a woman once, Marion McFarlane, who she tried to save a little native girl who was being beaten to death by one of the matrons. She came across this dorm supervisor who was beating an 8-year-old native girl to death with a piano leg, and she grabbed the woman and knocked her out to save the little girl. John Andrews, the principal, then fired her for hitting that matron. So the matron who was trying to kill the little girl wasn't fired. The one who tried to save her was.
Really?
And when in doing that, he said, whatever happened to that little squaw, he called her a little squaw, he said, whatever happened to her wouldn't have been as bad as losing that matron because she plays the organ in church on Sunday, and I need her.
Oh, my God.
So it shows you kind of like Native people are already dehumanized. In Canada, they're in a separate, they're considered not human, but Canadians don't like to look at themselves that way. But in reality, Native people are not seen as the same as other people, and they're already dehumanized. And, I remember mentioned in the film, when I saw what the church officials were able to do to me and put me through that hell, and knowing that my 6 and 2-year-old daughters were going to go through this incredible suffering just to get rid of me. Well, if they could do that to me, imagine what they could do to somebody who they didn't consider human.
Yeah.
Who wasn't a Christian, who was dark-skinned. Yeah, of course they can stand by and watch as they die. There's, how could an SS guard at Auschwitz do what they did and then go home and be a loving family, a loving father and husband, which I'm sure they were. Like, with that human capacity to be both, and a whole civilization to be both, right?
Mm.
To preach the words of Jesus and then turn around and murder thousands of people in the name of Jesus. The reality is we can do both. And
I mean, if you're coming from the background that you're sincerely and honestly believe that what you're doing is right because it's either serving the big daddy Yahweh or God or even the Führer, as it were, then I think they manage to justify that on their own kind of level, and they probably don't feel any guilt at all about it.
You're right, and in fact, religion allows people to do that.
Yep.
It allows you to kind of say, well, God, I have to do this for a higher moral principle. Therefore, my normal emotions and morality are suspended because of this higher purpose. You don't any atheists conducting terror bombing. I mean, it's a lot easier to blow up somebody or to kill somebody in the name of God than if you didn't believe in God. And that's very interesting. In fact, I read something recently where neurologists have discovered that the same part of the brain responsible for aggression is the area where people get the so-called religious impulse from.
Really?
And yeah, I don't have the story. I should look that up, and it's a very interesting article. One of the humanists here in Vancouver pointed it out to me once. But that makes a lot of sense to me, that, the religious ecstasy is tied into aggression. And therefore, the same impulse whereby you believe in this higher power allows you to act that out in an aggressive manner against so-called non-believers. So,
yeah.
Religion and genocide are very closely tied together. I think genocide is really a religious ideology.
Well, it is in a way. I guess you're right there, and in regards to the brain research, that's very interesting. I've heard, for instance, that this aggression is tied together with pleasure, and of course we know that on one level, religious euphoria, if you will, is a kind of pleasure, and people get the same stimulants as it was out of that as they do from taking a drug or what have you. So this is all connected in a way to potentially the fact that you are seeking pleasure in one way, and some people get it from religion, some people get it from violence, or even both, or the combination, or what have you.
Very much, and I think that certainly was the case in residential schools. A lot of these people, when I'm sitting every week in the healing circles with people and hearing their stories, they continually talk about these men and women who would basically, to put it crudely, would get off sexually by beating children, at the same time telling them that they have to believe in Jesus as their Savior. I mean, how can you believe in Jesus and His teachings and then go around and beat and torture and kill innocent children? I mean, you can do that if you're in that frenzied mentality that you're talking about.
Oh my God. Yeah.
But it's also more than that. It wasn't just that. There was a vested interest in the church doing that to people because they profited by it. They profited in land.
Sure.
They profited in money they got from the government, and so it was a big economic operation too.
Yeah.
And that was a big motive.
You mentioned, that they potentially got off on this on also actually on a sexual level. How about? we hear stories all the time about these pedophile rings, and that there actually is kind of a connection and a connection basically with some of the abuse that is going on and the traumatization. I'm thinking back of the recent story that over at on the Jersey Islands, for instance, in England, we heard similar accounts, if you will, of people being terrorized, or kids being terrorized, beaten, and buried, or even burned alive, and things like this, and that there was a certain amount of sexual abuse going on there as well. Has that been a big issue as well here?
Yeah, very much. I'm glad you raised that, because you talked about the way it carries on. In 1998, UNESCO released a report about child trafficking in the world, and they named 3 cities that were very prominent in child prostitution and pornography. And those cities were Bangkok, Rotterdam, and Vancouver.
Really?
Yeah, Vancouver is a big center of the pedophile networks, and they're a continuation of what was started in the residential schools. One of the reasons the United Church has been so determined to smear me and kind of destroy me is because I've discovered that these pedophile networks continue today. They operate out of a place called the Vancouver Club, which is kind of the elite club in Vancouver, where a lot of the judges and politicians and church leaders all have memberships.
Really?
And children are regularly brought in there from Indian reserves around Vancouver, and they're used. And there's over 500 missing Aboriginal women in Vancouver. I work on a community task force into missing people. The RCMP have acknowledged 9 disappearances, but there's over 500. A lot of these Native women are abducted and used in snuff films.
Really?
You know about the snuff film industry.
Yeah.
They disappear for that reason. There's burial sites around. We've even identified some of the burial sites. This can go on because Natives are not considered citizens and not considered human beings, and people turn a blind eye.
But
all of that is happening now.
Absolutely, and I must say that this happens to all races and all in all nations across the globe, it seems like. And I don't know how far up the ladder you've been studying this, of course, but there are people like Ted Gunderson, for instance, an American FBI, former FBI agent who studied, for instance, satanic ritual abuse and the connectivity with the pedophile rings and things like this. And I mean, this seems to go up all the way up to the top, the highest top of those who rule this planet. What do you think, Kevin?
I definitely think that that's happening. It's an international network, and it is controlled by very powerful men and institutions. And I think that there's reading about the whole skull and bones thing that the Bush family are members of, and all the American elites are part of.
Sure.
The destruction of innocence is always seen in satanic terms and others as the source of their power. If you can destroy using the blood of a newborn baby, corrupting the innocence of a child, they consider that in their own sick and twisted way as a way to gain power in the world. And the use of terms like rape of the land, all of that is tied in with this mentality that you get from the church, which is God means conquest and power over another. God is seen as a conqueror. That's the word, domine in Latin comes from our word for domination or conquest.
Yeah.
And so that's all intrinsic to our Christian culture. It comes from that fusion of the Roman Empire and the church and the whole ideology that was behind that. To be a Christian means to conquer in the world and conquer the innocent. And we see it playing out all the time.
Yeah, it's a really scary story, and it's again, that also makes it more important to actually talk about it and get it out in the open, as it will, because again, shutting the door to these kinds of subjects is going to make it much more worse as we go along. And again, all these, where do all the kids disappear? I mean, again, I know that there's occasional lists, published on, someone is keeping track on this and so forth. I don't know if you got any numbers on that, Kevin, but allegedly there are many kids disappearing each year. Where do they go?
I think Gunderson and some of the people I've read about in the States have estimated at least 100,000 children every year in the United States. It's a huge number.
Yeah.
And yet it's kind of like in these small communities. I know as a minister, the local guy who is a pedophile is always seen as very honored and respected in the community. It's their cover they maintain. And that was true in the residential schools. It's still true today. So it's really hard when you have that attitude of, well, he can't be responsible. He's such a fine, upstanding citizen. That's the wall you have to break through to say, well, look, it's exactly those people who are often the ones who are to blame in these situations.
Yeah. You mentioned the Vancouver Club. Is that is it a form of fraternity? Has it Masonic, Knights Templar ties, anything like that?
Well, definitely Masonic connections. A lot of the judges who are members are also Freemasons.
Right.
About half the judges in the BC Supreme Court are Masons. And of course, they take a secret oath to protect one another, even if they've committed crimes. So, there's that. But it's more than just Masons. It's like, literally, I've looked at the list of members of the Vancouver Club. It's every prominent establishment person in British Columbia on the west coast of Canada is a member of that club.
Politicians and even, I guess, celebrity, things like that?
Yeah, church lawyers, the superintendent of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, all the major politicians in that, a lot of very wealthy corporate directors. They're all members. We had, in 1999, there was a native reporter who saw children being brought out of the back of the Vancouver Club. He tried to interview them, but he was grabbed and knocked out, and his tape recorder was taken away. And so, the local newspapers were going to report on this, and they were approached by lawyers for the Supreme Court judges involved, and they were silenced. That was back in 1994. So, do you remember in Belgium, this pedophile network was broken up a number of years ago and exposed a number of judges?
Yeah.
And the head of UNESCO for Belgium was even implicated in this.
There you go.
Whatever country they operate in, they have a lot of political and judicial protection and police protection.
Well,
it's
exactly.
Very hard to penetrate.
Absolutely, and I think again, I mean that it's the top brass that are involved in this.